especially the emphasis on fan communities and race in fan communities is what makes the book special, and one of the many things that makes it wonderful. Carrington's writing has appeared in Present Tense, a journal of rhetoric and society, Callaloo, African and Black Diaspora Journal, magazine for the Studio Museum of Harlem, and books including a companion to the Harlem Renaissance, The Blacker the Ink, Constructions of Blackness in Comics, and Sequential Art and Black Gay Genius, answering Joseph B's call. Please help me welcome Mr. Andre Kennedy.
Thank you. I'm going to stand, and that will also facilitate your ability to see the visuals that I prepared. And there aren't that many of them, because when there are too many slides, you find yourself doing too much. And also people look at the slides instead of looking at you or listening to what you're saying. And that's always a challenge. To give you a sense of what I am doing here, I have been thinking about sort of the contribution that this book can make to science fiction studies and also to African American studies. I think of it as a project that encourages the fields to talk to each other, and in the ways that I haven't seen that going on, and in the ways that we are just starting to see that going on a little more, I wanted to bring a certain emphasis to it and outline like priorities for how that might go in the future, and this is my effort to do that. Not just through what's in the book and through what I can say about what's in the book, but also my effort to kind of expand the conversation that it brings up. And I had pre-circulated the first chapter of the book that some of you read, and that's excellent because then you have the inside track on the images I'm showing you and the things I'm talking about. But I'm really trying to figure out how to parlay what I can do and have done based on this book into examining texts and media that I haven't examined in the book, especially sound. So while I don't have any sound in the presentation today, except for my dulcet voice, I am going to use some examples from sound from the field of sound studies and from the study of music by people more knowledgeable than me about those subjects. And to give you a sense of where this is, I had a similar discussion with the American Lit Working Group at University of Pennsylvania recently, and got some great feedback about sort of how people see science fiction in the study of American literature and the sort of interdisciplinary connections that they make through it. And I'm also participating in the Penn Humanities Forum to sort of put this work and the work that grows out of it in conversation with the topic of translation, very broadly constructed, so that translation can mean something more or less synonymous with adaptation, right? The sort of transformation of meanings across media, or the persistence of a logic or structure in narrative and in culture across media. I was about to say form, but I'm always uncertain about what that means, and I was also about to say genre, but I have pointed opinions about what that means, so I can't say it now, but I'll say it in a minute. So what is speculative blackness? It is the center, for me, of a coarse network of associations between blackness and speculative fiction, meaning science fiction, fantasy, utopia, horror, things of that nature. To get at sort of how I've constructed that network and what comes into it, I want to provide some examples and give you a sense of how it might be relevant in a current conversation. So, oddly enough, the analysis really starts with, or dialogues with, Bob Dylan, who is in the news. So this is a juxtaposition of Nobel laureate in literature, Bob Dylan, and who you might recognize on the right from the pre-circulated chapter is the fictitious fan writer, Carl Brandon. This is, I think, figure 6 in the chapter. There are a couple of unexpected resonances between these images and also between images like these and other subjects in the book. And the idea to include this example of Bob Dylan came to me before I knew about the Nobel Prize thing, and it was a good moment for me to sort of reinforce what I had been thinking was necessary. I came across the image of Dylan while looking for texts about recording technologies as a factor in the production of classic science fiction texts like H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds and the radio play that's based on it. The article about Dylan that I came across that inspired me to look for images of Dylan in the recording studio was an article by Keith Nagus. And Nagus is a music critic whose book, Music Genres and Corporate Cultures, really spurred my thinking in speculative blackness, because it took an examination of the material and the everyday life dimensions of the phenomenon of genre. It was really concerned with what materially, technologically, and interpersonally makes what we call a genre that isn't necessarily part of the text or the texts in relation to each other. I'd wondered about that question long before looking at speculative fiction and blackness. I'd always wondered sort of what makes country, alternative, punk, and urban inherently racialized, and what makes them lend themselves to radio formats, but also to sort of broader cultural categories. I thought about the displacement of these terms across different areas, like speech patterns and fashion, as a kind of a sign of a resonance between the questions of space, class, and self-fashioning that they bring up, and also the cultural politics that you can detect in some of them, in punk and in the cultural politics associated with urban as a term in particular. Urban is a really historically specific term, right? It doesn't actually really apply to African Americans until the Great Migration, right? African Americans are a rural people and then start becoming an urban person and transform what urban means. And bring along with them blues and work songs that don't just come from an agrarian context, but come from an industrial context into another one, like the railroad work song and Gandhi dancing, things like that. So it has this cultural legacy that's sort of spoken to, but not quite spoken to by terminology like urban. On the other hand, punk has a complicated cultural politics, right? Kind of a lack of cultural politics, or a meta-politics that's very anarchic. It was seeing James Spooner's film Afropunk in grad school that brought this juxtaposition to my attention and made me think that there's something to this intersection of race and genre. It's important to note, I think, that the original title of Afropunk is the Afropunk, the Rock and Roll Nigger Experience, but as the film caught on and it seemed to be very true, people realized, oh, white people are going to have to say the title of this film. And when I saw it in grad school, at the same time I was managing an online archive of fan fiction that I read about in the last chapter of the book. And what I saw then and there was that when black people inhabit white spaces in the imagination, there's a certain kind of dissonance, and it's a dissonance that isn't adequately spoken to by terminology like punk, or urban as a term for space, or queer, or even really subsumed sufficiently by the sense of like an abstract sort of social ostracism that describes the nerd culture. I thought maybe an appropriate name for this sensation of black arrival in modern and contemporary culture is uncanny, because when black people show up in any place from which we've been excluded, it's always a return, right? Because whiteness is predicated on anti-blackness, it's often unsettling to see what was buried in the course of racial formation make its way back to the surface. What was supposedly sublimated or rendered invisible makes its presence known again. Avery Gordon refers to this deferred arrival as haunting, and that's one of the formulations that falls under the rubric of the speculative fiction of blackness in the book. One of the lessons I hope that readers get from the chapter about Carl Brandon, the black fan who was not one, is that he lives on long after the end of his existence as a hoax. Though he was created for the purpose of remaking the image of science fiction fandom in an ideal form that was more inclusive, he remains as a sort of ghost. Much like his predecessor, James Fitzgerald, or maybe Warren Fitzgerald, the Negro who was present at the birth of the first organized science fiction fan club, the Scienceers, who disappeared along with any other people of color from the annals of science fiction fan culture by the 1950s. Carl Brandon exists as kind of a trace. This is maybe the house where James Fitzgerald lived in Harlem in 1929. Maybe James, maybe Warren. The way that he was identified in the 1930 census was as white, but when people looked back at the address used for correspondence that he sent and received with the American Rocket Society, that's the address that it refers to. So I'm one of a number of people who was thinking, where is this guy? Where did he go? And at some point, he might have been here. Fitzgerald and Carl Brandon stand for a kind of trace, right, in the sense that Derrida uses the term. The notion that all concepts rely on difference from what they're not. The trace is a manifestation of the fact that the absence of one thing is the condition of possibility for the presence of some other thing. So sanity always gives way to the madness that it keeps at bay. The masculine never completely abnegates the feminine, and the boundary is always insistent on forestalling its dissolving, its dissolution into a borderland. Carl Brandon is a reminder that for white fans to meet the challenge of refuting charges of racial exclusion in the 50s, they had to do something. But Carl Brandon was the presence of blackness that made questioning the reasons for the absence of blackness no longer necessary. So fans were able to append the name of Negro to a person within their ranks without actually changing anything about the way they did business. They said that they had already achieved inclusion, they just didn't know about it. The revelation that he was never really present to begin with should have brought the question about his absence back up, but instead it remained silent. So the haunting quality in this case is that Carl Brandon lives on, as real and as black in the imagination of his readers and among the perpetrators of the hoax. The depiction of him in that first image, figure 6, demonstrates how the notion of his blackness persists across the divide between his existence as a desirable lie and his afterlife as a speculative fiction. Of course, these qualities are not really all that different. His absence and his presence are linked in the figure of the trace. So when it comes to this kind of dissemblance, or really any assertion about the ambivalence, the uncertainty, the arbitrariness of interpretation, there's more than one way to look at things. A more evocative formulation of the play between absence and presence that blackness initiates along the lines of genre is maybe the cut instead of the trace. The term is pretty familiar nowadays from its usage in the work of Fred Moten. And it's also more literal, right? So James Fitzgerald's presence and his absence elsewhere, the fact that he's present here but not present elsewhere, cuts the new Negro community into this internally differentiated intellectual space, right? Different intellectual currents in the black community. African Americans doing different things culturally, politically, and economically in Harlem in the 1920s. So much like Hugo Gernsback, who coined the term scientifiction to describe this mode of writing that would inspire scientific innovation through speculative narratives, and also like George Schuyler, whose contributions to this area I have yet to follow as closely as Sharon DeGraw in an excellent book called The Subject of Race in American Science Fiction. Fitzgerald's local vernacular interventions in the Scienceers and the American Rocket Society can be seen as bleeding through the demarcation between minor literatures like science fiction and African American writing, and the popular science discourse that DeWitt Kilgore names astrofuturism, which is exemplified by the rocketry enthusiast David Lasser, an erstwhile H.G. Wells fan, Robert Goddard, and later driven by expatriate Werner von Braun, who was inspired by the work of Jules Verne. Carl Brandon's later but wholly imaginary presence within fan culture, though less consequential, is structurally similar to these iterations of the cut. He was an assemblage, right? A presence put together in fan culture by the work of the multiple authors who conspired to invent him and believed in him. And at the same time, he was a cut within the racial imagination of this community of readers and writers who couldn't figure out how to make themselves an inclusive whole. At the end of the hoax, right, when it's exposed that Carl Brandon never existed, he lingers on as an exposed wound, riven between one set of meanings that endeared him to fandom as a burlesque interpreter of classic and contemporary literature, author of parodies that I write about in the first chapter of the book, but also as a kind of mascot for a group of white, multi-fig jazz traditionalists and blues enthusiasts, right? This image is produced after people know Carl Brandon never really existed. This cut demarcates one of the most important critiques that I try to lodge in the book that I hope I can carry forward into the topic of sound studies. Namely, I want to get away from the analogy between the marginal status of science fiction among literary genres, right? The notion that science fiction is not accorded prestige, is not considered as intellectually or aesthetically rigorous or dynamic, and the experience of racial marginalization. The epigraph to chapter 5 of the book, The Golden Ghetto and the Glittering Parentheses, exemplifies this juxtaposition, right, between the notion of the ghetto and the sense of the ghetto. So as an alternative, I try to direct the reader's attention away from the figurative depictions of difference for which the genres are known, robots, aliens, time travelers, ghosts, and instead toward the moments when race resurfaces as a meta-language and also the subtext. So you're probably thinking now, okay, well this is interesting, so it's like James Baldwin says this, but then they're using the term ghetto in a way that's totally abstract. But what does Bob Dylan have to do with all this again? And the reason that Keith Negus's work and his treatment of Dylan occurred to me as noteworthy and relevant to the topic of Carl Brandon today is that the article by Negus that I was interested in highlights what he calls Dylan's phonographic imagination. So rather than portraying him principally as an improvisational, acoustic-oriented folk artist inspired by the blues, or as a literary lyricist that's in the way that's culminated in his recognition as a world-class poet, Negus reemphasizes studio practice and electric instrumentation, an overall sense of production, of intentionality, as aspects of Dylan's work that characterize him as the author of records. Negus talks about restoring the sense of intentionality to the critical assessment of this musician to consider him as a phonographic artist as well as a performer. This distantiation from the analytic of performance, right, moving the artist out of the domain of performance and into the notion of writing, distinguishes the practice of values in one area of activity that prioritizes improvisation and spontaneity from values practiced in another arena that emphasizes a modernist ethos of technique, the use of technology, and a sense of historical determination. So integral to this treatment that Negus recommends is the recognition that Dylan emulated the electric blues, right? Not just the blues as heard and the blues as performed, the blues as felt and evoked, but the electric blues that he heard recorded in order to produce sound with a certain timbre, that's the distinctive quality of his work. So rather than identifying the sound in Dylan's records as a fictionalized sort of organic performance of a white folk genius, Negus locates the electric guitar as a kind of prosthesis that mediates between the black masculinity performed by blues musicians and Dylan's phonographic imagination, right? The image, the trace of a black masculinity mediated through technology, inscribed in his imagination, that he then reinscribes, not just in performance, but in recording, right? Through the use of similar technologies. So by emphasizing the sonic production of the record, Negus tries to implicate the recording artist in the construction of a sound world, a space that's already populated with listeners whose sensory imaginations are already tuned to certain frequencies, right? They know a black sound when they hear it, they know an authentic sound when they hear it, and it can be reiterated. The notion of the sound world, right, it grows out of social underpinnings. It's constructed as a representation of space, a field for the application of technology, an intellectual tradition, and a commercial enterprise. It has its own logic of presence and absence that gives it possibilities for hegemonic and counter-hegemonic practices. The recognition of Dylan's lyricism can't help but bring to the fore a revalorization of the sound world in which his phonographic practice articulates itself as writing, right? So in order to think of a sound artist as a writer rather than a performer, we then also have to think of the sound recording as a mode of inscription, a mode of reiteration, of reproduction, and in a way of reception rather than performance. So whenever a poet ascends through the ranks of cultural value, becomes honored, becomes venerated, they bring with them, right, a sense of the pen, right, the mark, the cut that they leave in the cultural record, but also a voice that's meant to be heard. So what I argue in Speculative Blackness is that the role of the author is only really as meaningful as their reception. And what interests me in trying to turn toward different media are the implications of reconsidering how we think about authorship, reception, and critical judgment for the concept of genre. Tara Rogers broaches a question that's something like this, that's inspired by the work of our early 20th century acoustic scientist Hermann von Helmholtz. The question she poses is, what for me constitutes life in a sound? Helmholtz conceptualized recorded sound in aesthetic terms, and he was one of the first critics to treat the waveform, right, the image of the sound wave, as a representation of sound aspiring toward the ideal of tonal purity, right? If it can be approximated by a mathematical figure and figured aesthetically in the visual domain, then it can have properties like beauty, simplicity, and purity that are appealing to the eye and therefore verify something about the nature of our other senses and the purpose for which we are able to produce and listen to sounds. Previously, sound was more closely linked to the body or the object out of which it emanates. Rogers cites Paul Gilroy to note that the valorization of discrete quantities in the aesthetic field, right, the whiteness of Carrara marble, or the economy of verse, evokes ideals of disembodiment, technical mastery, and scientific objectivity that are instrumental to the knowledge project of whiteness, and formative in the construction of difference from those ideals as deviance or degeneracy. This orientation leads to the phenomenon of treating electronic sounds as lively and distinct individuals, simulations that harken back to the bodies that they come from, that are of an organic or a technological nature, that may or may not actually exist, but whose only purpose really is to produce, right, to inscribe themselves as ideal forms in our imagination. Carl Brandon affected this kind of simulation in print, but once he passed out of association with real and imagined bodies, right, his imagined black body and the real white bodies of people thought to be distinct from him, then the fiction of his presence remained in the imagination of fans in the form of sound, in Josh Brandon's Blues and the illustration, and in the poem Yowl by Nick and Noreen Falaska that I cite in the chapter that's sort of an elegy to Brandon in his style that is itself a reinscription of the style of Allen Ginsberg. I'm especially interested in the implications of this line of inquiry for the representation of alien organisms, artificial life forms, and haunting presences like Haints in African American literature. How do they sound? And how do we sound to them? The questions at the edge of this exploration are the inscriptions of writing and phonography so different from performance and reception, the reproduction of sound? What is reading, if not the reproduction of writing? Is it listening in a certain sense? And what can we learn from the way that we hear things differently, the way that things resonate with us in different ways? Amid the many arguments about race and sound on one hand, and reading speculative fiction on the other, is the extension of this line of inquiry to fundamentally ask, what does it mean to listen to speculative fiction? So part of what's at stake in posing the question of whether medium, right, sound or writing or the visual, matters to the way that we approach genre is a fairly classical literary question. When we're talking about verbal language, how do we disaggregate the scriptural act, writing, from the lexical act of reading? And can we do that without seeking scientific grant money and practicing cognitive aesthetics and things of that nature? What happens to this distinction between the scriptural act and the lexical act in translation across media, when the scriptural act is the utterance and the lexical act is listening? Can a concept of audiencing or reception or fandom that constitutes and transforms meaning mediate between these fields? My tentative answer to that is sure, of course it can. But I can only suggest how this transfiguration takes place through a mixed metaphor, and it's not the trace or the cut, but alchemy. without getting into the cognitive dimensions of language, because that's not my field and I don't know enough about it, I think that we can learn from and observe the adaptation of literary text for performance and audio transmission if we treat that phenomenon as inscriptive and performative at the same time, right? That the remediation of literary text for the purpose of sound performance, for broadcast, for recording, but principally for listening, is a kind of alchemy. It transmutes something about what the text is that's both intact, but meaningfully, substantively different on the other end. I pose this question because sound is really the absent presence throughout speculative blackness. There are moments when I thought about treating concept albums, theme songs, and radio plays within the project, but I deferred. I try to make certain paradigmatic moments in the development of speculative fiction across media legible and amenable to a line of inquiry grounded in African American interests throughout the book, but sound eluded me the whole time. So I wonder now if there's a lens, or a mic, or a dish, or something in which I can capture the sense of what sound does for the intersection of race and genre, and how blackness figures into that tradition from its beginnings to its possible future. So that is where I am now. I know as much as you do now about this possible conversation. I'm very eager to hear what you think now.
I have a question.
Yes.
So basically, this is kind of a selfish question. But so basically, sound is not something that's kind of emerged. Like you began the project with sound, sort of already, or kind of. I guess can you speak a little bit to how sound became central to your thinking, or in sort of like the development of some of the concepts that you introduced in the book?
It was,
Like way to enter.
Alex read the manuscript, so he knows this. So it was at one point, I wrote about the turn away from sort of texts identified principally with what I call the whiteness of science fiction, with a sort of overweening sense of whiteness in which blackness arrives and changes something and has a new meaning or becomes meaningful in that context. In the shift from that to texts that sort of figure from within cultural traditions associated with blackness that produce sort of speculative imagery, in that transition, I thought about and wrote some about the album Fear of a Black Planet by Public Enemy. And I thought about it as a sort of, a use of sound as information and sort of information technology that speaks to what I call the speculative fiction of blackness. But it fell out because I didn't need it as a transition, even though it works, right? It's in the same conversation. But it sort of stayed there. It stayed away, and I published it later in another form, like by itself. So I had this like possibility to include sound, but not really to speak to it in a really concerted way, and not to theorize it in the ways that I think I theorize, the salience of print culture and the salience of visual culture throughout the book as like really invested in all the notions of what I'm trying to work with. Sound sort of like, I had it for a moment, and then I let it go, and I want to get it back.
Yeah, thank you.
Can you say a little bit more about the concept of the alchemy of race? You talked a bit about alchemy in the talk, but race explicitly never came up. So I take the phrase obviously from Patricia Williams, and what I think critical race theory allows us to do is to kind of think for the sake of argument analytically about how this is unreal, how it is speculative or surreal or a legal fiction, right? That there are all of these ways of treating it as constructed, I'm trying to remember who it is who names race as a sort of concrete abstraction, right? That it is all of those things, and I feel that critical race theory, through things like narrative, allows us to sort of accept that for the sake of argument, and at the same time treat the reality of race, whether we take that antipodal position that reality is like, it's material, it's felt, it's embodied, it's affective, it's historical, that we can sort of pull those things apart for the sake of argument and think about how we live with race as a concrete abstraction, right? How we live with it as an unbelievable, undeniable thing at all times. And I think that in the sense that Williams gets at how race has a sort of alchemical logic in everyday life and in the law, how it allows things to happen that don't make sense according to the rules, the norms, or the conventions of being a person or a subject in all of these domains of activity. Race nonetheless allows that to happen, and it would be inexplicable if we did not thoroughly understand it and need to understand it to survive. I think that the alchemy of race in speculative fiction, to me broadly, in any given medium, is that whenever, I think particularly when blackness as such is figured, but really whenever race is in the frame of inquiry, suddenly the questions about what speculative fiction does and what it is are fundamentally different, because it brings all of these questions that are not necessarily there on the surface. At the same time, the entire sort of, the traditions of black cultural production, if we were to say, for the sake of argument, that science fiction originating in like early 20th century print culture is not a thing that black people invented, right, but a thing that black people have contributed to from some externality. Like if we were to say that here's black cultural production and its lineage, we can find all of these, what I call speculative fictions of blackness, running throughout it. And we often give them different names, but they're kind of the same thing. I think that what alchemy means is a kind of an attempt to reconcile that, right? Like to take this cultural logic of exclusion that's disrupted and transformed, or this cultural logic of organic emergence or sort of prosthetic creativity that emerges out of blackness, and to sort of to reconcile them. That's how I mean alchemy of race, that it allows for transformations that at other times, analytically, I think we ought not to be sort of focused on, that we ought to sort of break things down. And I think that alchemy is a metaphor for sort of what happens when we attempt to transmute these things, to figure out the meaning of these things in relation to each other, when we could just as rigorously assume that they're meaningful to each other as separate, as external to each other. That's about as far as I am right now.
Go ahead.
Kind of listening to you talk, one of the things I wonder about in terms of incorporating sound a little bit more into the literary studies aspect, you emphasize in the chapter like the importance of intertextuality, but part of me is wondering about the term of like interplay, like the extent to which all these different voices and things can be heard, but not a little bit more or less. So one of the questions I had, or the things that I had written down, was you were saying that the role of the author is only as meaningful as the reception. And I thought it was interesting that in that chapter there were two authors, and the only one that seemed to matter was the black man, and not the voice of this white guy speaking, like that kind of went away. So I was going to ask what seems more, which one seems more important to you? You know, because if one is ignored but one isn't, you know, it seemed like you were emphasizing the blackness and yet described it as a haunting later.
I think I tried to associate sort of the like conspiracy to create Carl Brandon as not just the project of Terry Carr. Bless you. Even though he can be considered like a principal author, the fact that people were in on it and that other people needed to be in on it to make it successful in the way it was, and to like corroborate it so that if you ask somebody other than him about Carl Brandon, somebody else can answer. I think that sort of it decenters the notion of like Terry Carr, literary genius, or mischievous figure or trickster from the authorship of Carl Brandon, because I think, well, Carl Brandon's the trickster. It's not Terry Carr, especially because it's Terry Carr and it's these other writers too who were in on it. So even if it were about the people, the authors behind perpetrating the hoax, it would be about multiple people, and it isn't really their genius that formulates this black figure as a trickster or as a deceit or a conceit. It's really that, well, he's out there, you know, they let him out, and he does these things and acquires this reputation, and it's that reputation that takes on the significance of like, oh, here is what writing in fanzines is like. Carl Brandon is the example to go to. And like, yeah, you can say like, you know, Terry Carr et al. Are the authors of these things, but I think it's actually meaningful and it teaches us something to think like, wait, no, this is what we're learning, and what we're learning from is this Carl Brandon phenomenon created by a sort of, you know, this consensual delusion that people are in on. So that's kind of how I view it, right? That we have to treat Carl Brandon as if he were real, or as if he were happening, right? In a way that is very different from considering him something that happened in the lives of these people.
I guess.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
I just had a question about going back to alchemy, really, and I was just wondering whether you kind of saw the acts of reading and reproduction or adaptation. Do you see it more of sort of an amplification and an enlargement of the author's sort of intention, or do you see it as sort of vandalism of, or do you see it sort of chipping away at the original idea, like a Plato idea of the work, or do you see it as a sort of building on it, or do you see it as bringing out aspects of that idea that weren't lit to begin with?
Yeah, I think of it as an accretive, proliferating process, a process of adding or generating more, maybe like by division, but like generating more, in the sense that like you can't talk about the War of the Worlds without talking about it in this form that is both the American radio adaptation and its legacy and the British text by H.G. Wells. And I think that in that sense, once the adaptation happens or the translation into another medium happens, we have one thing, and that one thing is multiple things, and we have those discrete things too. So we have lots, we keep having more. In part, that's a way to get away, to evade the question of like adaptation deviating or degenerating, right? And to shift the analysis from the sense of like getting it right, to the question of like doing something else as what is at stake in the process of adaptation. And I think that is valuable for certain texts that are sort of spoken for already in those terms, but also for other texts that are not so thoroughly understood as existing in these multiple states. The example of that in the book that's closest to it is the chapter for which I showed the epigraph about an episode of the TV series Star Trek Deep Space Nine, and the novelization in book form of the script for that episode that's written by, the novelization is written by black science fiction writer Stephen Barnes. And because he is adapting it for the form of a novel, it becomes something different, and it also acquires multiple registers, right? Multiple discourses flowing through it, multiple voices that are cited by the author and sort of portrayed as part of the performance that is going on in this text that you might see on TV. And also just different repertoires of knowledge that he brings to it as a Black author that compound sort of what the Black actor and director of the episode are doing in bringing the script to the screen, and also compound the sort of abstract questions that are laid down in the script by the white writers who authored the screenplay. And I think of that adaptation as something that doesn't necessarily always travel with, right, the TV episode or the script for the TV episode. Novelizations are not talked about much in any area of literary study, or really in media studies and in the study of adaptation. Novelizations are like they're just not happening. But they're, the only thing they're really integral to are properties like Star Trek and Star Wars, these legacy texts that have all of these different forms. And in this instance, Stephen Barnes's contribution to it positions him and sort of brings him and all of the stuff he's doing into the discourse of what, you know, contemporary science fiction writing is, that we would otherwise characterize in a quite different way, that we would otherwise not have to talk about, like, why do these writers call it Sword and Soul, or like, why do these writers place this thing in a prehistoric or a quasi-medieval African society, or like, why do they evoke these connections to ancestral African peoples, or African Americans' ancestors, or not these people that they... So like all of the things that Barnes does, all of this Black stuff that you have to think about in order to consider what he has done with the Star Trek text, amplify all of the Black stuff that the performer and director bring to the text that has already inscribed what the universe of Black stuff needs to be. and I think of adaptation as as a kind of, it's alchemy rather than chemistry, because you can't make something out of nothing, right? Unless you break the rules of how things actually work, right? Mm-hmm. And alchemy is like, sure, you could break those rules, and then you do end up getting kind of something out of nothing. You do end up getting something that would otherwise violate that rule. And I think that's what happens in the creation of text like that.
I was going to ask something about the relationship between sound, the speculative, and Blackness. And it hadn't really occurred to me until you presented it in this context, the image of the of Carl Brandon, right? That his afterlife sort of depends on this authentication through sound, right?
Yeah.
Or an image of sound. So I was wondering, given, even if it's not historically accurate, that we tend to think of speculative fiction in relationship to the written word and the visual, right? But most of the, and we generally tend to think of sound as not speculative, but on the other hand, as you mentioned, most of the work that Black artists have done within the realm of the speculative has been in sound. How can one bring those different areas together, right? And how does one read these sounds speculatively? And so I'm wondering what that, if you could sort of say a little bit more about that particular tension, right?
It's like like sort of the Blackness of sound and the whiteness of science fiction are not operating concerns in my analysis so far, right? In the book I introduced this idea of like, oh, the speculative fiction of Blackness. It's these things that I talk about, and it's also sound things and sound performance things and some other art forms that other authors talk about in the discourse of Afrofuturism that I don't talk about that well or that much. And part of the reason for that is that I feel that the discourse of Afrofuturism can do the work of understanding, sort of Black speculative thought and creativity through sound very well, and can do it from a position that says, of course, right? Like, of course Black people do this thing through sound, through performance, through spontaneity and improvisation, but also through this sort of information technological infrastructure of sampling and signifying and reiteration, and like a sort of embodied repertoire of performance. Like, I feel that Afrofuturism can speak to that domain of Black creativity and critical practice from a disposition that says, like, of course Black people do this is just Black. But it doesn't quite ask, like, how is it that this is Black? Or how is it that Black people do this? And I think that is a question that requires another kind of work. So like those terms, right, like the Blackness of sound and the whiteness of science fiction, that's a terrible pairing and I need a better one, right? And so for my purposes, the idea of sound studies and adaptation being somehow centrally shaped, informed by racial discourses, including like normative race thinking, but also including like dissident and dissonant practices. There has to be more to that, I think, than the notion that we have radio plays like The War of the Worlds, and then we have this stuff Black people do, right? I'm skeptical about that. I'm not like anxious because I'm like, it's cool, other people will do that really well. But what I'm skeptical about is the notion that I can make that work. I think instead, examining radio plays based on the work of Black authors and radio plays that incorporate Black sound in certain straightforward or discrete ways is one way to do it, because it can shift our thinking about sort of what do Black people do? Oh, of course, Black people do this. And then on the other hand, why is science fiction presumptively white? Oh, of course, it's like this. It consists of these things. If instead we re-articulate that tradition of radio drama and the sounds that make up science fiction texts that sort of insist themselves into other forms like cinema and like radio drama and like reading, if we sort of re-examine those things and consider the role that race plays in the construction of the sound world and the construction of the other senses implicated in the text, then maybe we can figure out how race thinking is there all along, and from there we can say, okay, well, what kind of race thinking? That's sort of where I am, right? Like where in the text, right, in The War of the Worlds, right, the sounds the Martians make are really interesting in H.G. Wells's text, and that's a question that is, I think, brought to us from the fact that, like, oh yeah, of course there's a radio play, and the radio play, in part, it adapts those sounds, and it consists of all kinds of new sounds and all other uses of sound. But in the print text, the sound images, the images of like, the heat ray sounds like this, and the Martian big walking machine sounds like this, those are like, they're inscriptive and they're performative, right? Like, the Martians don't walk like that, there are no Martians, but to the extent that they're figured through sound, they then take up residence and populate our imagination in the form of a discernible sound, a simulation of a real or imagined body, and that the alien quality of that sound, I think, is really integral to the tradition of science fiction radio drama, which is why it's a starting point. And I think that in other iterations, in a radio play based on Beloved, that was on BBC Radio, the way that sound is definitely integral to the production of that text is really critical. But at the same time, a question that Madhu Dubé has raised is that we should think twice about sort of Black authorship and Black text portraying themselves as something other than written literature, right? So that if we portray the written text by Nobel laureate for literature Toni Morrison, as a sound work, we're missing something about the place of blackness and literature in the modern world, and examining sort of the construction and the transformation of sound through the legacy of that work is something that I think can allow us to ask, like, not just what does it mean that the sound of a baby crying is part of this text, but also, like, what does it mean when we characterize the text in terms of a sort of a more sonic epistemology because it's black, as opposed to, like, a text that we have to treat as print in order to position it as the antecedent for for iterations in other media that include sound. So, like, those questions are at stake for me because they require us to sort of step away from assumptions that are spoken to at the intersection of sound studies and race already, and come back to them and see, like, okay, what else can we say, or what else can we ask?
Questions, comments?
Are you interested in any way in trying to sort of hold on to a particular kind of black aesthetic? Be it like visually, narratively, or in terms of sound? Are you invested in that for any reasons, be they politically or theoretically or no?
Yeah, I'm interested in being able to take hold of it,
Okay.
like, when it seems like important. And I'm not always sure when that is, but I think there is, like, I think that in the example of the treatment of the Star Trek text by Stephen Barnes and the role of Avery Brooks, the actor, and bringing it to the TV screen, I think that the sort of the episteme that they bring with them is really vitally, not just because they say so pretty explicitly, but I think in ways that are, like, recognizable and that we have to sort of make sure we see or make sure we read. They're very concerned with doing that, with making the episteme that is black something that they bring to the text that otherwise wouldn't be brought. And I think being able to take hold of that and understand its value is important to be able to do. Because I feel like if I can't, right, like if I am, like, listening to a radio play and there's something about the way that Samuel Delaney tried to insist but not insist that the character who's the protagonist in his work is black and uses his own voice in that performance, there's something to it. It's not necessarily a black aesthetic to which I think I can, or I need to, or an author needs to subscribe, but there is a value in, I think, being able to take hold of it, even if it's just to, like, articulate something else with it. You know, to say, like, oh, well, you would expect this story or this performance would be all about these things spoken to by a sort of canonical black aesthetic that can be summarized in these terms. And if what is at hand is, oh, well, Delaney creates this black character who is gonna be black, and gonna be black just like him, and who will, you know, he and others will be called nigger in the 25th century in this text, like, don't get it twisted.
Right.
If he is doing that, then he's trying to, or I am trying to, contribute something to that understanding of what blackness encompasses that complicates an otherwise reified sense of what a black aesthetic or what a black repertoire of aesthetics is. And I'm like, well, I don't want to forget it even exists just because there are a variety of other examples outside its boundaries. I want to think of what is outside the boundaries I've assumed it has, and understand how they are in fact related, because of course they are.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm interested in taking hold of it, but not in, like, forwarding it, and not in, like, advertising for subscriptions to it, because I think that's I'm not mad at anybody for naming black people as the authors of distinct speculative fiction traditions. I'm like, that is so good, thank goodness. But because I come to it as, like, critic scholar fan, I'm like, well, I didn't make it. My role in making it is in this reception, reproduction, interpretation stance. And from there, I don't think I can invest in the same way in the authorship or in the naming of what this tradition is. And so that's sort of where I stand in relation to it. It's a tough question. Y'all are smart. And of course, but like they're tough and necessary questions.
Might thinking about but might thinking about musical instruments be a way to think of sound in relation to genre, or to kind of be your point of entry in thinking about how sound or the configuration of race and genre maps onto sound?
Yeah. Describing the electric guitar as a prosthesis is really key for me. It's not the term Megas used, but to me it seemed like, oh, that's what this is.
Right.
Because it sort of, right, it speaks to how the language and voice and things like that, I think of as sort of prosthetic in a certain way, as technological, but the instrument or the body as the place from which the sound emerges, or from which we imagine it emerges, if it's synthesized, if it's a simulation. I think it's meaningful to ask, like, what is the thing that's pointed to by this emanation? Right? What is this vibrating through, and where is it vibrating from? Right? Also, what medium is it moving through? And so I think the instruments, yes, are important. I'm glad people have written smart things about microphones and studio space, because I don't understand how that works, but I'm glad that it is a thing I can learn about. But musical instruments, I'm not sure how deep in the weeds I can get, because I think part of the reason that we can name a field sound studies is to sort of disaggregate music and noise and other kinds of sound from each other, but acknowledge that we're doing that, right? I think that's important to do.
Right. Well, I would also say that not all, yes, instruments can be used to make music, but I think because of the kind of intimate space that instruments have often taken shape, they often produce sounds that are not necessarily part of a musical notation or a composition that come to signify all these things.
Right.
And so I think there's longer I guess histories and legacies of how instruments come to signify certain sensibilities, and so maybe in that way thinking about how certain sounds of particular instruments come to signify whiteness or by abstention, right?
Right.
That might be a way to just think about.
I agree, right? It's very hard, for instance, to avoid stereotype is a good word for it, because the stereo part, right? In cinematic sound, it's very hard to avoid in speculative texts, but in any variety of texts, right? The evocation of people's racial and ethnic background through stereotypical stock sounds, right? Through horribly racist stereotypical sounds that evoke the exoticism of people who are East Asian or South Asian. It'll be painful to listen to that in Doctor Strange, just as it is painful to see Tilda Swinton perform a role for which she would be very qualified if she were Asian. So there are challenging things about it, and it's painful to avoid drums whenever Black people show up in things, or whenever Black people's Africanness is referenced in any concrete way. But it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just something that doesn't need to be underscored from that standpoint of the obvious, right? It's interesting when it's made interesting, but it's off-putting when it's in lieu of doing something meaningful. And so I think about that as something valuable. In the Deep Space Nine episode, Avery Brooks was really concerned about the music
Right.
in the episode fitting the moments. And there are moments when like he stumbles over the piano keys and it produces right a dissonant sound, right, a cacophony, and that's important to the affect and all of that, right? And moments like that are really interesting, not just when they're like discordant and disruptive and transgressive, but like they just create a texture. So yeah, I hope musical instruments populate the sound world, and I hope I can like reckon with their presence.
Thank you.
Let's thank Professor Carrington.